Hello, and welcome to today's Mind Your Career webinar program. My name is Sam Constance, and I work with the Alumni Career Development team here at the University of Chicago. Thank you for joining us today. It looks like we have people tuning in from a wide variety of industries. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Interdisciplinary Thinking, How Cross-Functional Risk Management Enables Business Strategy. Aileen Filmus is a security and risk strategist passionate about mitigating threats at the intersection of global security, privacy, and cybercrime. Her background includes security program leadership, GRC, counterterrorism research, geopolitical intelligence, and analyst experience across a diverse range of international organizations. Prior to her work at hypergrowth unicorn Brex, she founded the Geo-Cyber division at consulting firm Versprite, the first of its kind in the cybersecurity space. The group assesses how political, economic, social, cultural, and regulatory factors serve as drivers of threats and opportunities to companies' financial, operational, and reputational health. She completed her International Relations Master's program at UChicago under the guidance of John Mearsheimer and Robert Pape. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Aileen Filmus.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Hope the audio is okay. Sam, let me know if not. Thanks so much for joining today. I am extremely passionate about this particular topic. It's kind of woven its way in and out of my education and my career, and it's something that I really like to talk about with people no matter what stage of their career they're at. It's relevant. So today I'll break down kind of what we'll be going over. So first, we'll talk about the fundamentals of the interdisciplinary approach, what it's meant to me, how I think it can be used, and sort of the benefits. Next, we'll be a little bit more practical and get into how we can operationalize intersectionality through something called enterprise risk management. Next, we'll talk about lessons from the security domain. This is sort of to serve as just an example of how your domain can be applied to other departments within your organization. And so I'll kind of use my own experience, and hopefully that'll inspire you to kind of dig into your toolbox and figure out how you can apply your niche, education and other kind of background into your work and your colleagues. Next, we'll talk about how using risk can actually enable growth and enable business strategy, that it shouldn't be viewed as just kind of another operational burden on your organization, but something that actually stimulates the growth of your company or your team. And then in the end, we can kind of summarize, go over what we learned, and have a little bit of a Q&A. And then afterwards, I can send some resources your way based on the questions you ask. So let's get started. Fundamentals of the interdisciplinary approach. So cross-functional collaboration is, really important for different people within an organization. You could be kind of leveraging this or not, depending on your mindset and how you do your work, but I'm a big proponent of it, and I'll go into why. So when we think about interdisciplinary approaches, the way that I think about this is just the intersectionality between domains. It comes back to finding connection between seemingly disparate pieces of information. And so I inherently kind of already thought this way, but then I started digging into this topic and why it was so special to me. And I actually found out that the word intellect is rooted in that exact idea. When we look at its etymology, we're actually seeing that the concept intellect means bringing together, or the between, or the among. And so I found this really interesting because it's sort of, supported on what I've been thinking all along. And when we think about, advancements, it kind of happens at the intersection of fields, right? So we think about biotech or evolutionary psychology, or something that some of you may have heard of, which is IoT, or Internet of Healthcare Things, IOHT, which again is intersection of different fields. So I think that that's really interesting. I hope you do too. In that case, you're in the right place. But a little bit of background on how I discovered this. So in my undergraduate studies, I went to a school called UC Santa Barbara here in California. I looked at all the available majors and found a lot of things interesting, but I had this niche that I really wanted to pursue. And that was the study of power and international relations. So I was interested in things like corruption and genocide, and issues that I felt were rooted in this specific topic. And so instead of trying to kind of, bypass Cool. Instead of trying to kind of pick and choose a major that would fit that, I decided to develop an interdisciplinary studies curriculum of my own. So that was the theme, and it combined elements of political science, of philosophy, of ethics, sociology, even some religious studies. And I found that really, really gratifying because it combined all of these different fields, and I was able to pull the relevant pieces out. So that was sort of like the foundation of that. Then after college, I joined this nonprofit international development organization. It focused on conservation of historical places like UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And so I found myself working with archaeologists and historians and sustainability experts, something that was completely new to me. But I kept seeing these connections to my background. And I was already starting to think about global risk then. This is around the time when ISIS was destroying artifacts across Iraq and Syria. And I was seeing this intersectionality even between things like archaeology and historic preservation and terrorism, and more specifically terrorist psychology of trying to erase, dissent really by erasing culture. So meanwhile, I was applying to grad school. University of Chicago has always been my dream school, and somehow got in. And I knew I wanted to study international relations, which in itself is interdisciplinary. So the classes I took were across history and poli-sci and philosophy, sociology, economics, even military science was made available. And then during my program, met some amazing professors. One of them was Robert Pape. And I ended up doing a fellowship at the campus think tank called Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism. Now that T actually stands for threats. And then I did some writing on other global risk subjects, as well as terrorism. And then I met a mentor at the company I ended up working at, who made me realize kind of the intersectionality between terrorism and cybersecurity. That we're looking at different threat actors, different types of attacks, different assets that we're protecting, but in the end, it's all the same type of analysis. And so this theme was just making its way, through the course of my career more and more. Then I joined a consulting firm called Burstbright and worked with clients on security, privacy, learning kind of the practical applications of risk. And then I founded a new practice within the company dedicated, you guessed it, to another interdisciplinary area called geocyber risk, which, as Sam explained, focused on the intersections of geopolitical trends and cybersecurity. So things like nation state sponsored attacks and how the macro environment really shapes cyber threats. And then most recently, I joined a fintech called Brext. Again, an intersection, this time financial services and technology. I'm part of the security team, but I belong in the engineering department, which I'm not an engineer, but it's no accident that in my everyday job, I end up interacting with other parts of the company more often than my own. So, the common denominator for all of this interdisciplinary thinking I found to be was risk. And risk is the tool that I use to think in an interdisciplinary way. And so that's what I want to share with you. This background is just to kind of give you the context from where these conclusions came from, and hopefully you can apply it to your own life as well. So what is risk? The way I see it is risk is identifying problems and opportunities proactively. Enterprise risk means doing so in a holistic manner, so across the organization. As you can see here, the holistic philosophy means that there is no such thing as a purely legal risk or a purely financial risk or a purely cyber risk. All of these are kind of functions of one another, and they're inherently connected. And so when you look at all of these different areas, and there might even be more that apply to your organization, if so, chat them in. I always find this really interesting. There's no separation. I mean, things can manifest more, emphasizing one area over another, but in the end, they're all connected. So that's the way that I think about risk and the way that I've encouraged my clients in the past and my current organization to think about risk. What I think is really important here and comes back to that interdisciplinary mindset is diversity of thought. So I like to say, the number one enemy of risk mitigation or risk management is this idea that because it's always been done this way. And this kind of narrow-mindedness is really unfortunate to see, both in terms of like internal operational stuff and also external kind of growth of the company. And so when you have different perspectives, different voices, and fresh eyes, that's really the thing that you can do to avoid this type of thinking. So I would encourage you, if you're hiring or if you're, trying to see what other groups you can partner with, think about the diversity in terms of their education, what their domain is, what kind of background they have, what kind of past roles they've had, what kind of work they do today. Even cultural differences can serve as a great kind of tool for risk mitigation, because people have different understandings and then can come up with ideas that are completely different than your own. And then another one is years of experience. So, obviously years of experience is super important. We can see more experienced people as having gone through more events and being able to spot things earlier. But oftentimes you can see people with fewer years of experience that actually can see things in a fresh way and actually notice risks before they happen that others don't, because they're just seeing something more objectively. So when I think about my team and the teams I work with, this is one of the most important things, is having that diversity of thought and encouraging it. So that was a lot of theory. And when I was at UChicago, we joked about this phrase called "theory is God." I don't know if that's still a thing at University of Chicago, but I'm always reminding myself to kind of get into the practical as well, and not just the theory. So how do we put all this into action? How do we operationalize this intersectionality? And my answer is through enterprise risk management. So some practical ways to kind of operationalize this, and how we as leaders can really kind of build and implement our roadmaps in a way that's conducive to risk management. So whether you work in a small company, a big corporation, I know we have a diverse group here, a nonprofit, a government organization, a think tank, whether you're an engineer, an analyst, marketer, consultant, thinking on behalf of your client, whatever it is, you can and you should incorporate risk into your everyday thinking. It really does apply to all of us. Organizations tend to get siloed, where you have people in different parts of the organization kind of functioning without considering the big picture. And that's where you, as kind of a thought leader in enterprise risk, if you bring this back to your organization, can bring all of those pieces together. And I wouldn't think of interdisciplinary enterprise risk management as something like additional that you add to your plate. It's more actually a way to prioritize and keep up with change and grow. And so I'll go through the framework and you'll see how it works, but I would just encourage you to think about it as something that's more like a solution to how you work rather than an additional thing that you need to do. So this is the most basic risk framework. There are tons and tons out there, but I think this is always a really good place to start. So number one, risk identification. So think about what are the top 5 risks that face your organization. This could be internal to the organization, it could be external to the organization, but that's always a good place to start, because it forces you to focus your attention and really prioritize what are kind of the most impactful things. Next is to think about risk communication. So there are 2 elements here. One is about terminology. So a lot of companies that try to instantiate a risk program run into the problem that everybody is using different terms to talk about the same things. And so I would encourage you to really think about what are the terms that you want to use, how do you define different types of risk. There are a lot of helpful kind of terms out there like risk appetite and risk threshold. These are all the things that you should define within the context of your organization, and really kind of spread that to the organization so that everybody's using the same terms. One thing you could do is create a risk policy or a risk charter where all of this is defined and super clear for everyone. And it's much easier to build this in than to try to fix it once something's already broken. So I would say that would probably be like one of the first things to do, is put together kind of a charter or like a glossary of terms. And then the second part of communication has to do with stakeholders. So once you identify those top 5 risks, who needs to know them? Who's ultimately responsible for accepting or remediating them? And how will you let them know? And then as far as remediation tracking goes, this basically means that you can't just identify the risks and then leave it at that. There are things to be done with them. So what I've liked to use in the past is a risk register, which is just simple. There are a lot of tools out there, but you can just use a simple Excel spreadsheet to track risks. And some of the things that we think about are, of course, the description of the risk itself, the severity, so how bad is it, the impact, so what would this do to our organization, what is the remediation, so how do we fix it if it's possible to fix, and then something called residual risk, which basically means like what risk remains even after we've applied all of those controls, even after we've fixed part of the problem, is there anything else that we should be aware of that's just an inherent part of the issue? That's called residual risk. So once you kind of do this, you can do it monthly, you can do it quarterly, it kind of becomes muscle memory, and it sort of becomes just the way that you think. When you're making a decision, when you're faced with some kind of question, it just sort of becomes your own mental framework for how you interpret it and how you make a decision. So, if anybody has questions, put them in the chat, but I think it's a really great way to start, and then you can kind of mature it from there. Last thing I wanted to say about this is, don't forget that risk also includes opportunities. When we think about risk, it's not just all these scary things. It could also be things that enable the business that we'll talk about later. But thinking about what's going on in the changing landscape that your organization could take advantage of or should take advantage of is a part of risk management as well, and it can make a huge difference both for you and your career, and then for the organization that you work in. So COVID-19 is a great example of this. So obviously it represents an unprecedented amount of operational risk, but this is also an opportunity to introduce more automation, to adapt to working from home, to adapt to the changing environment by producing services and products that are actually needed in today's landscape. So there's kind of two sides to everything. Of course, there's a lot of negative to what's happening, but it's also made a lot of businesses adapt and kind of thrive in their own ways by listening and being aware of what's happening and what their customers need. Great, so moving on. So like I said, I'm in the security domain, so this is simply just an example of how I and my teams have used our security knowledge to help the rest of the organization. But I would love for you to think about this from your perspective, whether you're in marketing or an engineer or in government, what you can apply from your specific subset of knowledge to colleagues in other groups. And again, feel free to chat that in. In my particular case, something that we have been able to apply is the study of bad actors. So obviously I work in fintech. If anybody else is in finance, that fraud is always top of mind. And so, both the fraud and the cyber teams are constantly thinking about the bad actor and trying to stay ahead of them, understanding their motives, the way that they think, the ploy that they might devise next. This is something that both groups have in common. And even if you're not in finance, there's always a malicious actor to be aware of. Maybe for you, that means leakage of company secrets or insider threat, which basically means somebody who works at the organization who might harm it. And so this is something that we've had in common as well with the fraud team as well as the legal team, just studying bad actors in a systematic way that allows us to really understand their thinking and how we can kind of always be a step ahead. Another thing, so this is something I learned in the security consulting world in my last role. So amongst numerous companies of all sizes and maturity levels, there's sort of a tendency to wear blinders and forget that there's a whole world outside of the organization. And that world is evolving all the time. So security experts in particular are constantly looking on the outside. That's the majority of our job, is looking at what's out there, what's changing, what trends we can pick up on. And so this is something I always encourage cross-functional partners to do more of. Closely study the external threat landscape. Don't get stuck inside. And think about the political, the social, the economic, the cultural, even the competitive landscape to help shape your organization's strategy. Another topic that I learned in my consulting role was threat modeling. So it's a fancy term, but basically this goes back to the bad actor psychology concept and kind of takes it a step further. So we're all aware of kind of the use cases for data modeling. I would think of threat modeling as kind of the qualitative form of that. So when you think about an external threat to your organization, you map it out. You start with a bad actor's motives, the strategy they might employ to harm your organization, the defenses you have that may stop them or slow them down, how they could bypass those, what impact this would have, how quickly you could recover, and then what more can you implement to prevent that kind of thing in the first place. So even kind of without the notion of a bad actor, this is just a simple exercise of if A then B, if B then C, if C then D. And once you start actively thinking in this kind of threat modeling way, just like I said earlier, it sort of becomes muscle memory, and it kind of almost happens in autopilot where you're thinking about this in a more strategic way. And it's really, really powerful. And it's, not easy to start doing, but once you get the hang of it, it just sort of becomes part of your framework for interpreting information again. I'm happy to answer any questions on that one as well. And then, so what I just described may sound like paranoia, and I'd be lying if I said, that you're not going to find security people who are paranoid. We've seen a lot, so there's that element, but this is not meant to cause you anxiety thinking about repercussions and consequences of events. It's not about trying to boil the ocean and be aware of all the threats that are out there. It's about empowering the right decision making, and simply being aware of how the most palpable risks, right? We talked about top 5 risks. That could be 3 or 10 for you, depending on the size of your company, how they could manifest. And again, which opportunities you might not want to miss out on. So just know that, the goal is not to make you paranoid. So third-party due diligence. So what we mean by that is your organization, chances are, works with external parties who perform some kind of service or provide a product to your organization. This is a core part of security because we know at least 30%, and that number is going up every year, 30% of data breaches are caused by third parties. So basically, if somebody hacks into your vendor and the vendor has your sensitive data, or worse yet, the sensitive data of your customers, now that cyber criminal does too. So doing security due diligence on vendors is just a standard part of security. But there are other parts of the business that benefit from vendor due diligence and might not be doing it. Of course, when third parties are selected, we think about the function they serve, the cost, all that stuff. But the type of analysis security does can also help us understand other risks, like whether working with a company may present reputational risks for us. If it has to do with the supply chain we're seeing today, there may be geopolitical risks involved. If it's some kind of complicated technical integration or maybe operational risks for your engineering team, there may be risks to us if we think about financial solvency of the company, again, relevant today, and our dependence on them. So a vendor going out of business might mean we have to replace them. Those of you in sales and marketing know the term customer acquisition cost. What about the financial and operational cost of switching a provider? So because security reviews bring so much value for security teams, we recommend to the rest of the organization that we do broader vendor due diligence, and we can help them kind of have the methodologies ready to do that. So any questions on that, feel free to chat in as well. So using risk to enable growth. So we talked about how we can use interdisciplinary thinking and cross-functional collaboration and enterprise risk to help the organization function better and avoid losses. Now let's talk about kind of the external side. So how it enables you not only to maintain your organization, but to help kind of unlock its growth. So whether, again, you're at a for-profit or not, all organizations care about growing and improving, and external perception is really important. So whether or not we're involved in sales, all of us kind of have a customer in at least an abstract way. So that kind of brings up the topic of reputational risk. So because, like we mentioned earlier with that big orange chart, the basic premise of enterprise risk is that it's holistic and that all the different parts are interrelated. You can connect any risk back to reputational risk. When you're doing that threat modeling exercise, think about the reputational impacts as well. This could be, not just of your whole organization to the outside, but even of your department to other departments. It's just always a good thing to keep in mind because that's sort of like the output of all of these other risk management topics. And then around due diligence assurance. So we mentioned earlier vendor risk, third-party risk. Risk is really a double-edged sword in that just like I'm encouraging you to implement risk, other organizations are doing it too, and they might apply it to yours. So if you're evaluating third parties, you will also be evaluated as a third party. You could be, a vendor to a customer or just as a partner. And so doing enterprise risk management allows you to kind of prioritize and provide assurance to an external party about your own business. It shows them that you know your weaknesses, you're aware of what may harm you, you know how to protect yourself, which helps them protect themselves in turn as well. And so, customer sentiment is an ever-moving target. And so differentiation is basically a way for your company to use its strengths to beat out competitors. Again, not only is this relevant for like for-profit companies, but also if you think about nonprofits or any sort of organization that cares about perception, which, as I said earlier, should be every organization. So customer sentiment being an ever-moving target, as societal norms change, so do these expectations. We're thinking about what customers need, want, expect. COVID is a prime example of that. People's expectations of speed is another example. So automated kind of self-serve models where customers don't need to make calls to solve a problem is becoming not just like a nice experience, but an expected one. In addition to that, with the influx of data breaches and data manipulation by big companies, something we've experienced on our side is that customer trust around private information being kept private is becoming more important to the extent that it could actually be a differentiator for a business to have strong security practices, and a customer may choose them for that reason over someone else. So I'd encourage you to think in your everyday lives, what does this mean for your organization? How can you turn the specific kind of elements that you see in customer sentiment as a benefit for you and make it a differentiator to unlock the potential growth for your organization? So I want to give everybody a chance to ask questions. I think now would be a good time to do so, Sam. And I'll just keep these up.
Okay, great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, perfect. And if you'd like to give your summary, I'm happy to. Otherwise, I'm happy to throw some questions your way, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, sounds good. So in all, to me, interdisciplinary thinking means progress. We saw some examples. I told you what it's meant in my life and hopefully what it continues to mean in my life. The way that I make interdisciplinary thinking super practical is by using risk, specifically enterprise risk management. I strongly believe that it can and should be applied everywhere, no matter what organization you're a part of. It can be implemented in one way or another. And there is an easy and practical framework that I shared with you, and happy to provide more details on that. If you practice that, it really becomes muscle memory and will really help to, you'll see results very quickly because you're really thinking about your company in a very holistic and sort of big picture way rather than being stuck in the details. To think about risk holistically, it'll unlock potential, enable growth, and empower your workforce. There's my sales pitch for enterprise risk. So happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aileen. We really appreciate it. And to all of you on the line, if you haven't asked any questions yet, please feel free to drop those in the question box for our moderated Q&A here. But we do have a couple to start with. So here's one. Aileen, is there any way to consider the unknown, the risks that I might not even have on my list?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great term, the unknown unknowns. In the security world, we do a lot of what's called threat intelligence research. So gathering data from lots of different sources and really trying to learn from the mistakes of other organizations. When I talked about thinking about the external threat landscape, that's exactly what I meant. So rather than just thinking about your docket of risks, so you sound like somebody who already does risk management to some degree, the unknown unknowns really stem from looking at that external threat landscape. So what is my company profile? And what are similar companies, and what can I find out that's been done to them, or that's happened to them if it's not a kind of bad actor risk. So learning from mistakes of others is number one. And then as far as threat modeling goes, I think that basically is the unknown unknowns, because you're hypothesizing, right? You're kind of simulating whether it's an attack or some kind of change in the environment. Even if it's something like the pandemic, that kind of mental exercise of simulating this happens, if that happens, then this happens, if that happens, then this happens, is a way to kind of, come up with those unknown unknowns. But no matter what, like I said earlier, there's no way to boil the ocean. There are always going to be surprises that come along. And all you can really do is just try to map out the various scenarios and learn from them. So in security, we have this practice called tabletop exercises. What that means is we basically practice an incident. So something bad happens to the company. How does everybody respond? And then we role play through that. And in the end, we do something called like a post-mortem, or lessons learned, when we look back at all the decisions that were made and then think about what could we have done differently. And that's where you basically are just trying to cover the breadth, right? It's like a, like a fishing net. You're trying to pick up everything you can. There are always going to be things that slip past, but just widening that breadth more and more is what's going to kind of reduce the odds. But yeah, so just to summarize, number one is understanding the external threat landscape. So watching your competitors, watching other companies like you, having dedicated people within your company, depending on the size, who analyze, what's going on externally. And then number 2 is threat modeling. So thinking about how you can simulate, mentally or with a group, different events and the consequences.
Great. And here's another question. Is there any literature, perhaps books, journals, blogs, etc., that you might recommend for early career professionals trying to gain a foothold in this field?
Yeah, so many. So I'll send a list to Sam after this, and then maybe you can email that out with the recording. There are a ton, and depending on what you studied, some are more abstract than others. So there's a lot of literature that's around kind of like the philosophy of decision making and how organizations work and the interpersonal relations and like all of that stuff. And then there are really practical kind of like step-by-step risk management framework guides, and a lot of organizations that are solely dedicated to producing these. So I'll share a whole list with Sam after this, and you can get started on your summer reading list.
We've all got the time now, right, to be doing our reading.
That's for sure.
Great. Here's another question. Do you have any examples of risk trade-offs? For example, helping risk A might make risk B worse?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, third-party risk is always top of mind. So a trade-off that we think about a lot is build versus buy. So what that means is you can procure a software to provide a solution to a problem or just a need that your organization has, or you can build it in-house. I mentioned earlier, third parties are a leading cause of breaches. So what that means is you're inherently taking a risk by sharing any data with an external party. So there's that option that you're basically outsourcing something to a vendor, they're taking care of it for you, but you know that they have access to your information, and that poses a threat. You can mitigate that threat by understanding how they process your data and what they do with it and what their security controls are. But that risk will always remain. On the other hand, if you keep it in-house and if you build that function without relying on that vendor, then you don't have to worry about giving your information to an external party. You're building it in-house. But as you can imagine, there are trade-offs to that, where that means you're taking up your engineers' time. You have some operational trade-offs where they're spending their time on this versus something else. The quality of the product might not be as high. So that would be like a really simple example. But trade-offs always exist, and that's a good thing to think about when you're kind of working on that risk register. Is when you're thinking about the remediation, it's like, okay, so the severity will be impacted this way, it'll be less of a problem. However, it may present this other problem, and then kind of map it out that way. So great question.
And here's another one. As an economist / MBA PhD change leadership expert, I combine the economic and behavioral risks and costs for clients of different behaviors and culture factors in companies. Do you have any tips for quantifying behavioral risk factors?
Well, first of all, I would just love to have a conversation with whoever this person is. That is really, really interesting. Yeah, so quantification is a huge topic in risk in particular. I can't speak specifically to economics or econometrics at this moment, although I can do some follow-up research for you. But in the domain of risk, kind of the leader of risk quantification is this organization called FAIR. I can send a link. Basically, they have this whole methodology of how, ambulance. They have a whole methodology of how you can quantify specific risk events, their impact, and coming back to that trade-off topic, what remediation will do to that number. So there's like a whole formula. I'll share it with you guys. But yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mentioned earlier that threat modeling is sort of the qualitative way, but there are also quantitative elements you can include there. So when I think about quantitative risk analysis for my organization, you're always trying to connect it to the dollar. So when you're thinking about a breach, for example, you can again look at other organizations, see the costs that they've incurred, and incurred costs could mean loss of revenue as well. What they've incurred due to a breach, and then try to kind of model that back to your organization. And so again, coming back to that simulation and hypothetical thinking around, if this were to happen, how much would we lose? That's a really powerful tool, both in terms of just the value of the risk analysis, because you're actually connecting it to something palpable, and then back to risk communication in that You may be working with clients, maybe the person that you're working with is like a CFO or director of finance. They want to be thinking in terms of dollars. That's kind of the language that they use. But yeah, your field sounds really interesting for obvious reasons. So I would love to chat after this.
All right, here's another question. Where does the board fit into the assessment of risk? In your view, should the board audit committee cover ERM, or should there be a separate board risk committee?
Great question. It's actually something that my organization is tackling today. So in my opinion, the board should be what we call the acceptor of a risk. So accept ACC-EPT. So your role in risk may be to identify those risks, right? So we talked about thinking about the actual risk, the severity, the impact, the remediation strategy, and the residual risk. I would recommend whatever those risks are, you communicate them to the board, and then it's their job to either accept the risk and say, I know this is a risk, but we're going to do this anyway, or recommend the remediation of it. So say, you've already made your recommendation of the strategy, and then they either accept or they say that they want to remediate. There are several ways to do this. So what's common is to have, like you said, like an audit committee. So an audit committee, generally auditors think in a little bit of a more binary way. So because they have kind of a list of controls that they need to fulfill, right? Risk management may be one of those controls. But the reason why this interdisciplinary thinking is so important is because, again, you want to be thinking about the big picture. It's not about complying with one particular control or one particular compliance framework. It's about that connected with all of the other elements. And so I think in my experience and what I would recommend is, members from the audit committee can be part of an enterprise risk management committee or a risk management committee, but they kind of think differently, so they're not one and the same. And so the structure that I would follow would be form the enterprise risk management committee. This could be, with people from legal, finance, security, if depending on the size of your organization. And anyway, depending on your organization, you figure out who belongs there, and I can help with that as well. And then you discuss those risks, you formulate what the top risks are, and then that goes up to the board. And then that way they have, you're giving them the transparency where they have the oversight into you, again, knowing what your weaknesses are. And then, you have a board for a reason. They can actually guide you through the prioritization of those things. So helping you understand which they may not deem as important based on their overall big picture view onto the organization versus others that they do. And also the other thing as well is that board members all come with their own expertise as well. And so again, you have that extra fresh perspective on the issue and on the risks that you identified.
Great, and we have one more question here that's come through, although we do have some more time. So if anyone else has questions, feel free to throw them into the chat box or the question box here, and I'll ask Aileen. But here's the question that we do have. So you spoke to the importance of perception. What are the best practices that you have for marketing or sharing our security practices to our customers?
Yeah, this could be a whole other webinar. Yeah, so I strongly believe that more and more the climate will be such that security will be a differentiator. With everything that's happened in the last couple of years with various companies kind of misusing customer trust, abusing customer trust, we've seen different compliance things come up like GDPR that are trying to harness that. But I really do believe that more and more people will choose companies, both in the B2B and B2C realm. People will choose companies that make their privacy practices transparent and care about customer trust. So this is what I've done for past clients and in past organizations. More and more, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to get due diligence audits. So customers will be asking you about your security posture, different programs that you have. And that's all great, and you can answer those questions, and hopefully, you have the right answers, and you're being accurate and also providing assurance. But I really think that the best way to go about this is to have proactive information. So I think there's a fine line between sort of marketing speak and actual helpful information. I would avoid using, hyperbolic language in any of the marketing Collateral, definitely, you never want to sound like we've got your back, or like things like that just sound very cheesy at this point because they've been overused. So I would just keep the security information very, not to say neutral, but just give the information that you have. If you're talking about the security program you have and all of the great security controls you have in place to protect your customer, just give that to them straight. In my organization, we created this like security package that basically is the Q&A about our security program, what we do, the controls we have in place, how we handle data, and it doesn't have all this flowery language that a lot of I've seen other companies do, because I think that that's really counterproductive with such a sensitive topic. It's sort of like, again, in the COVID era, imagine, doctors being super hyperbolic with the things that they do and all of these solutions. It just doesn't sound authentic. So I would say, put together something proactive, put together like a security package that's informative but doesn't read as collateral. A lot of companies will do white papers. I think that's a great idea. Again, as long as the language doesn't get really hyperbolic. White papers are basically like, you can pick a topic that your company's been working on and use it as a way to show your company's security posture. And so put together something proactive and then just be really authentic, because there's so much security language out there today that just sounds, it just doesn't sound like that. And so, I think authenticity is your best friend here, and anything you say, of course, be able to back it up with real evidence.
Great, and we totally agree that authenticity really makes all the difference. And I have one last question here for you. How has your job changed in light of COVID-19?
Good question. Well, we are entirely work from home, and we were one of the first organizations in San Francisco to work from home. Ironically, in my last job in consulting, I was working from home as well. So that part's not that big of a change. I think everybody, generally in the Bay Area, I think people took this threat really seriously. I think, we shut down really, really early. We adapted to that. I think that a little bit of like panic set in because everybody has, parents and grandparents and kids and everything that they're worried about. A lot of my colleagues are working from home with their little children at home, so that's definitely a big change. So I think in a lot of ways, operationally it was difficult in the beginning. I think our IT team really stepped up and made it really kind of as smooth as possible. But I would say culturally within the company, people are more, not that they weren't before, but they're more kind of like patient with each other, and they're more understanding and more compassionate, because everybody's going through something with this, even just like the emotional factors. I think everybody is just, we've kind of gotten closer as a team, and everybody just wants to make sure that everybody else is taking it all okay. So that's what I would say from kind of like a people standpoint. As far as the work goes, I wouldn't say that COVID specifically impacted security teams. I mean, there's a heightened threat in that anytime there's some kind of like event or fear around something, or even something like tax season, you always see an uptick of cyber events because bad actors are and fraud. Because bad actors are trying to kind of leverage that feeling of uncertainty and what's going to happen. People being in a more panicky mood may result in them, responding to an email that's malicious and things like that. So we're more on guard as a security team. But the work that we're doing it's the same volume and it's the same kind of work, thankfully. So hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to everyone for participating today, and a special thank you to you, Aileen Filmus, for sharing your insights on this very important topic.